83 people stood along the rail fence at the Harlan County Fairgrounds on a Saturday in October of 2021, and the rain had been coming down since before 6 in the morning. A thin, persistent drizzle that turned the pull track into something between clay and paste, the kind of surface that grabs at tires and holds them like a hand closing around a fist. And most of those 83 people had an opinion about the woman standing next to the 1967 GMC 9500 parked at the far end of the staging lane. Most of those opinions were wrong. The truck was rust orange along the lower doors, a color that had nothing to do with paint and everything to do with the 47 winters the truck had absorbed before she got her hands on it. The cab was the original factory green, faded now to something closer to the color of a sage field in August, and the exhaust stacks, two of them rising behind the cab, were dark with old carbon and rain. There were no sponsor decals. There was no matching trailer. There was a woman in a gray canvas work jacket checking the lug nuts on the rear duals with a torque wrench she'd owned since before her daughter was born, and she was doing it the same way she did everything mechanical, without announcement, without performance, without any apparent awareness that anyone was watching. The performance shop was called Ridgeline Fabrication, out of Bowling Green, and the owner had driven his rig up on a 3-axle gooseneck trailer pulled by a truck that cost more than most houses in the county. His name was Travis Holcomb, and he had 47,000 followers on Instagram and a YouTube channel where he talked about horsepower in the particular way that people talk about things they love but have not fully understood. The rig he'd built was a 2004 Chevy Silverado 2500 with a compound turbocharged Duramax that his shop had dynoed at 812 horsepower, and he had printed that number on a banner that hung from the side of his trailer. 812 horsepower. The banner was laminated. It was not getting wet. She noticed the banner. She glanced at it once, the way you glance at a speed limit sign you've already memorized, and then she went back to the rear duals. Her name was Carla Briggs, and she was 38 years old, and she had driven the GMC 9,541 miles from the town of Evarts that morning. In the rain, alone, because her daughter Lily was at the fairgrounds already, had come with a neighbor family the night before for the carnival portion of the weekend, and Carla had known that Lily would be at the fence rail before the pulls started, because Lily was always at the fence rail, had been since she was 4 years old, and Carla had first started bringing the truck to local events. And sure enough, when Carla pulled into the staging area, she could see Lily through the chain link, 7 years old now, in a yellow rain slicker, standing at the rail with her hands wrapped around the top bar, watching. Lily watched everything Carla did with the same expression, a specific, focused stillness that other children didn't have, the look of someone who is not merely observing but cataloging, filing, storing. She had asked Carla once, when she was 5, why the truck made a different sound when it was cold than when it was warm. Carla had answered her fully and correctly, and Lily had nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. Now, Lily stood at the fence in her yellow slicker, watching her mother check the lug nuts, and Travis Holcomb's crew was laughing about something near the trailer, and the rain came down steadily over the Harlan County Fairgrounds, and none of them knew what was about to happen. But I need to stop here, because before I tell you what happened on that pull track, I need to tell you who Carla Briggs was, because without knowing who she was, this is just a story about a truck that got wet. And it is not that. Carla grew up in Evarts, which sits in a valley between ridges that block the afternoon light by 4 o'clock in winter, and she grew up in a house where the garage was more important than the living room, where her father kept a 1971 Cummins NH250 on a stand in the corner of the shop for the better part of a decade, turning it over on weekends and evenings after his shift at the mine. Not because he had a specific plan for it, but because understanding it mattered to him, the way understanding a language matters to someone who has decided they are going to live in a foreign country. Her father's name was Dale, and Dale Briggs had the kind of mechanical knowledge that comes not from school, but from the specific combination of necessity, curiosity, and time. The knowledge of a man who has fixed the same machine in the dark, in the cold, twice, and has learned not just what to do, but why it works. Carla was in the shop with him from the time she was old enough to hand tools without being asked which one. By the time she was 12, she could identify a fuel delivery problem by the sound of the engine at idle. By the time she was 16, she had rebuilt the carburetor on Dale's 1968 Ford F250 twice, and the second time she did it faster and better than the first. Dale watched her work and said very little, which was his way of saying everything. He died in 2013, a Tuesday in March, a heart attack at 61, and he left Carla the tools, the shop, and the NH250 on its stand, still in pieces, and a notebook in his handwriting that was 40 pages of engine specifications, clearance measurements, and observations written in the margins in pencil, the kind of notes a man writes when he is trying to understand something deeply enough to trust it. Carla was 29 when he died. She had a daughter who was 2 years old and a husband who was gone by the following January, and she had a job at the parts counter at the Napa in Harlan, and she had the shop, and she had the tools, and she had the notebook. She, the tools, and she had the notebook. She found the GMC 9500 in 2017 on a farm outside of Baxter, parked behind a cattle barn under a corrugated tin roof that had been keeping most of the rain off it for 11 years. The farmer's name was Gerald Combs, and Gerald was 74 and had driven the truck commercially from 1971 to 1989, and had then parked it when the cost of a needed injection pump rebuild exceeded what he was willing to spend. And it had sat there since, and Gerald had not been in a hurry about anything since 1989, and was not in a hurry about the truck either. Carla paid him $4,200 for it, which was every dollar she had saved in 11 months of working the parts counter and taking on small engine work on the side, and she drove it home on a borrowed trailer because the injection pump situation was still unresolved. She resolved the injection pump situation over the following 4 months, working evenings after Lily was in bed, the shop lit by a pair of fluorescent work lights and a trouble light she kept clipped to the underside of the hood. She rebuilt the pump herself using a kit she ordered from a supplier in Ohio, and her father's measurements in the notebook, and a level of patience that is difficult to describe to someone who has not sat in a cold shop at 11 o'clock at night, alone, with a precision instrument disassembled on a clean rag in front of them, understanding that the only way forward is through. The engine in the GMC 9500 is a Detroit diesel 671, and I need you to stay with me here for a few minutes because this is the part that explains everything that happened on that pull track in the rain. The 671 is a 2-stroke diesel, which means it fires on every revolution rather than every other revolution the way a 4-stroke engine does, and it was designed in the late 1930s for marine and industrial applications, which is to say, it was designed for the kind of work that does not stop, for the kind of load that does not give you a rest, for the kind of sustained pull that would destroy an engine that was built for anything less. The 671 produces its peak torque, and this is the number I want you to hold on to, at 1,400 revolutions per minute, 1,400 revolutions per minute. That is a low, slow, patient number. That is an engine that does not need to scream to do its work. Now, Travis Holcomb's compound turbocharged Duramax makes 812 horsepower. That is a real number. That is an impressive number. That number is produced at somewhere between 3,200 and 3,800 revolutions per minute, which means the engine has to be spinning fast, has to be working hard, has to be in a specific narrow band of operation to produce that force. It is a knife. It is a very fast, very sharp, very expensive knife. Here is what a progressive sled pull does to a knife. The sled, the weighted sled that the truck is pulling down the track, uses a transfer mechanism that progressively shifts weight forward onto the skids as the truck moves down the track, which means the resistance increases the farther the truck goes. It is not a fixed load. It is a growing load, and a growing load punishes an engine that needs high RPM to produce its force, because as the load increases, the engine slows, and as the engine slows, it falls out of the power band, and as it falls out of the power band, it loses the very thing that was supposed to save it. The 671 does not have this problem. At 1,400 revolutions per minute, it is already where it needs to be. The load increases, and the engine leans into it the way a draft horse leans into a collar. Not faster, not louder, but with a kind of patient, implacable insistence that has nothing to do with drama, and everything to do with the physics of torque at the bottom of the power band. Carla knew this. She had known it since she was 14 years old, and had watched her father explain it at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and she had understood it then, and she had spent the intervening years going deeper into that understanding, modifying the 671 over 4 years of careful, deliberate work. A rebuilt injector set, a period-correct governor adjustment that opened the fuel delivery curve in the low RPM range, a transmission rebuild that tightened the torque converter lockup to reduce slippage under load, a rear axle regear that she had done herself in the shop on a Sunday in February with Lily sitting on a stool reading a library book about ocean animals. Travis Holcomb did not know any of this. He had looked at the GMC 9500 when Carla pulled into the staging area, and he had looked the way a surgeon looks at a folk remedy, with the particular patience of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the evidence to confirm it. He had said something to the man standing next to him, and the man had laughed, and Carla had heard it, and Lily had seen her mother hear it, and Lily had watched her mother's face, which did not change. The rain was heavier now, coming in from the northwest, and the pull track had absorbed enough of it that the clay surface was dark and slick-looking. The kind of surface that would be a problem for a truck that needed wheel spin to find its RPM, and not a problem at all for a truck that was going to move at walking pace from the moment the chain went tight. The atmospheric conditions mattered here in ways that are easy to miss if you're not thinking about them. Cold air is denser than warm air, which means more oxygen per cubic foot entering the engine, which is, for a diesel, a direct input to combustion efficiency. The temperature at the Harlan County Fairgrounds that Saturday morning was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The 671 was breathing cold, dense, oxygen-rich air, and it had been doing so for the 41 miles of highway driving that had brought it up to full operating temperature before it ever reached the staging area. Carla had timed her arrival specifically for this. She had left Evarts at 6:15 in the morning, so that the engine would be fully warmed and the oil fully circulated and the tolerances fully settled by the time she needed to hook up to the sled. The rain was a complication for the track surface. It was an advantage for the engine. She had not told anyone this. She had thought about it, planned for it, and then she had driven 41 miles in the rain and checked the lug nuts and waited. Lily was still at the fence. There was a boy next to Lily, maybe 9, in a Carhartt jacket 2 sizes too big, who had been watching the Ridgeline fabrication rig with the specific reverence that 9-year-old boys reserve for things that are large and loud and covered in sponsor logos. He had a bag of kettle corn. He had offered Lily some, and Lily had taken a handful without looking away from her mother's truck. The boy had followed Lily's gaze and looked at the GMC 9500, and then he had looked at the Ridgeline rig, and then he had looked at Lily. "That old one's gonna lose," he said. Lily didn't answer him immediately. She watched her mother put the torque wrench back in the tool bag and close the bag and set it behind the driver's seat. "She knows something you don't," Lily said. The boy looked at Lily. Then he looked back at the truck. The pulls ran in class order, and the Ridgeline fabrication rig went 3 classes before Carla's. Travis Holcomb's pull was everything it was supposed to be. The Duramax lit up with a sound like a turbine spooling, the exhaust stacks throwing black smoke into the gray sky, the crowd along the rail responding to the noise and the spectacle the way crowds respond to noise and spectacle, which is with immediate and uncritical enthusiasm. The truck launched hard, the rear tires fighting the wet clay for a moment before finding grip, and it moved down the track fast, the sled's resistance building, and it pulled to 247 feet before the engine note changed. A subtle thing, a slight roughening at the top of the power band, and the truck slowed and stopped and the crowd cheered because 247 feet in those conditions was a legitimate pull, and Travis Holcomb knew it and climbed out of the cab with the composure of a man who has just confirmed what he already believed about himself. 247 feet. That was the number. Lily watched her mother walk to the cab of the GMC 9500 and open the door and climb in. She watched the door close. She watched the exhaust stacks. The 671 started the way it always starts. A bark, a clatter, a sound like something mechanical waking up from a long sleep, the 2-stroke firing pattern establishing itself in the first few seconds with a distinctive rhythm that anyone who has spent time around Detroit diesels recognizes immediately and does not forget. An older man, 3 spots down the fence rail, a man in his 70s with a thermos of coffee and a seed cap that had been through a great many seasons, turned his head when he heard it. He had been leaning against the fence post with the posture of someone conserving energy for the moment that mattered. He straightened slightly. He said nothing. He listened. The 671 settled into its idle, a sound that is difficult to describe to someone who has not heard it. Somewhere between a mechanical heartbeat and a low industrial song, a sound that carries its own particular authority, the authority of an engine that has been doing this since before the people watching it were born. The rain came down on the hood and the exhaust stacks and the faded green cab, and the truck sat at the line the way it had sat in Gerald Combs's barn for 11 years, and the way it had sat in Carla's shop through 4 years of evenings, patient and indifferent to opinion. The hookup crew attached the chain to the hitch, and Carla let the truck roll forward until the chain went tight, and there was the sound, that specific, singular, metallic note that a chain makes when the slack comes out of it and the force begins to transfer. And Lily's hands tightened on the fence rail. The GMC 9500 moved from the line without drama. There was no tire spin. There was no roar. The exhaust stacks darkened and the engine note deepened, and the truck moved, at walking pace, into the clay. And the clay pushed back, and the truck kept moving. 25 feet, 50 feet. The crowd was quiet in the particular way that crowds go quiet when something is happening that they did not expect. A silence that is not boredom but attention. The sound of 83 people recalibrating. 75 feet. The sled resistance was building, the weight transferring forward onto the skids, the load increasing the way it always increases, gradually and then insistently. And the 671 responded the way it was built to respond, dropping a few RPM, the governor opening the fuel delivery. The torque coming up from the bottom of the curve the way water comes up through a deep well. Not fast, not spectacular, but with a volume that does not diminish. 100 feet. The engine note had found a register that was lower than idle and steadier than anything the crowd had heard from the previous pulls. A sound that was less like a machine working hard and more like a machine working at exactly the right speed for exactly the right task, which is what was happening. The older man with the thermos had set his thermos on the fence post. He was watching with both hands free. 125 feet. Travis Holcomb was standing near his trailer, arms crossed, and the expression on his face had changed in a way that was subtle but visible to anyone who was watching him instead of the truck, which most people were not, but Lily was, because Lily was watching everything. 150 feet. The crowd was not quiet anymore. There was a sound beginning along the rail. Not a cheer yet, but the precursor to one. The sound of people making involuntary noises when they see something that exceeds their expectations. Small sounds, sharp intakes of breath, a single word from someone near the far end of the fence. 175 feet. The clay was curling up around the edges of the tires the way earth curls up around a plow blade, not in loose sprays but in dense, deliberate ridges, the tires pressing into the surface and finding it and holding it, the truck not floating on top of the track but engaged with it, in conversation with it, the weight of the rig working with the resistance rather than against it. 200 feet. The boy in the Carhartt jacket had stopped eating his kettle corn. 225 feet. The 671 had not changed its note. It had not surged. It had not struggled. It was doing at 225 feet exactly what it had been doing at 25 feet, which was the whole point, which was everything her father had written in the notebook, which was the reason she had spent 4 years of evenings in a cold shop with a trouble light clipped to the underside of a hood, and the reason she had paid $4,200 to a 74-year-old farmer in Baxter for a truck that had been parked since 1989, and the reason she had rebuilt an injection pump at 11 o'clock at night with her daughter asleep in the house and her father's measurements on the rag beside her. 247 feet. The number. Travis Holcomb's number. The GMC 9500 passed it. The crowd at the Harlan County Fairgrounds made a sound that Lily would remember for the rest of her life. Not the sound itself exactly, but the quality of it. The way it came from 83 people simultaneously and involuntarily, the way it was not performed but extracted, the sound of people who have just understood something they did not know they were capable of understanding. It was not a cheer yet. It was the moment before the cheer, the moment of comprehension, and it lasted only a second before it became something louder. 260 feet. 275. The truck was slowing now, the sled at maximum resistance, the load at its heaviest, and the 671 was working at the absolute bottom of its capability. Not the bottom of its failure, but the bottom of its design, the place where the engine was built to be. And it held there. It held, the tires turning slowly in the clay, the exhaust darkening further, the frame of the truck flexing slightly under the load the way a bridge flexes under weight. Not breaking, just honest. 290 feet. 300 feet. The truck stopped at 304 feet, which was 57 feet past Travis Holcomb's pull, and the crowd was doing what crowds do when something has been proven that they did not believe could be proven, which is everything at once, noise and movement, and the specific human response to witnessing something that will not unhappen, something that is now permanently true regardless of what anyone thought before it occurred. The 671 idled down. The exhaust stacks cleared. The rain came down on the hood. Carla Briggs climbed out of the cab and stood on the running board for a moment, one hand on the door frame, looking down the track at the distance markers the way a farmer looks at a field she has just finished planting. Not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of work completed according to plan. Then she stepped down to the ground and walked to the rear of the truck and crouched down and put her hand flat on the driver's side rear tire, checking the heat, checking the wear, doing the thing she always did after a pull because the truck needed to be driven home. The older man with the thermos picked it up from the fence post. He took a long drink. He said, to no one in particular, "She's running a 671. He said it the way you say something when you want it confirmed by the air around you. Then he nodded once and put the thermos back under his arm. Travis Holcomb walked across the staging area. He stopped a few feet from Carla, who was still crouched at the rear tire. She stood up and looked at him. He looked at the truck for a moment. Then he looked at her. "What did you do to the governor?" he said. "Period spec," she said, "plus the fuel delivery curve." He nodded slowly. He looked at the exhaust stacks. He looked at the faded green cab. He said, "How long did it take you?" 4 years, she said. He nodded again. He looked like a man doing arithmetic in his head that was coming out differently than he expected. Then he said, "I'd like to see the injection pump sometime." "Call ahead," she said. He walked back to his trailer. Lily had come through the gate by then, the yellow rain slicker dark with rain across the shoulders, and she walked to where her mother was standing and stood next to her and looked at the distance markers still visible on the track. The clay was filling in around the tire marks from the rain. Slowly, the way ground recovers. 304, Lily said. 304, Carla said. Lily looked up at her mother. "The boy said you were going to lose." Carla put her hand on the top of Lily's head, briefly, the way you touch something you know deeply. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you knew something he didn't." Carla looked down at her daughter for a moment. Then she looked back at the truck. "Go get your bag," she said. "We're driving home before it gets dark." Lily went. Carla stood at the rear of the GMC 9500 with her hand flat on the fender, and the rain came down on both of them and the track was quiet now, the crowd dispersing toward the covered areas, the pull finished, the distance permanent. The boy in the Carhartt jacket found Lily near the gate. He had folded the top of his kettle corn bag down carefully. He looked at Lily with an expression that was working through something complicated. "How did she know?" he said. Lily picked up her bag from where she'd left it against the fence post. She thought about this for a moment, the way she thought about things, thoroughly, without rushing. "Her dad taught her," Lily said, and she didn't forget. The boy watched Lily walk back toward the truck. He stood there for a moment in the rain, and then he turned and looked at the GMC 9500, where Carla was checking the hitch coupling with the same focused attention she had given the lug nuts 3 hours earlier, and he watched her the way Lily had been watching her all morning. Not with the reverence he'd given the Ridgeline rig, but with something quieter and more durable, the beginning of understanding. The GMC 9500 is still in the shop in Evarts. Carla drives it to events when the season allows, and she works the parts counter in Harlan 4 days a week, and on the 5th day she is in the shop, and Lily is often there with her now. Not sitting on a stool reading about ocean animals, but standing at the workbench, handing tools, asking the kind of questions that a child asks when she has decided she's going to understand something fully. Carla answers her the way Dale answered Carla, completely, without condescension, with the patience of someone who knows that the understanding being built right now will matter in 20 years in ways that cannot be predicted. The notebook is on the shelf above the workbench. 40 pages of penciled measurements and specifications and observations in the margins. The handwriting of a man who wanted to understand things deeply enough to trust them. Lily has read it twice. Travis Holcomb called the following March. He came on a Thursday, drove up from Bowling Green, and he spent 2 hours in the shop looking at the injection pump and the governor and the transmission rebuild. And he asked good questions, and Carla answered them. And before he left, he stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at the GMC 9500 for a long moment. "You built this on purpose," he said. "I built it on purpose," she said. He nodded. He drove back to Bowling Green. He posted nothing about it. The 671 is still running the same fuel delivery curve, the same governor adjustment, the same rebuilt injectors. The rust on the lower doors has not gotten worse because Carla addressed the drainage issue in the spring of 2022. The exhaust stacks are still dark with old carbon, and they will stay that way because the carbon is not a problem and cleaning it would be vanity. And Carla Briggs has never had time for vanity. 304 feet, in the rain, on a track that was trying to hold the truck back, with an engine that was designed in 1938 and rebuilt in a shop in Evarts by a woman working evenings with a trouble light and her father's notebook and the kind of patience that does not announce itself but cannot be stopped. The ground doesn't lie. The clay doesn't care what something cost or when it was made or whether it has a banner on the side of its trailer. It just tells you what it is. If you know a story like this one, a woman, a man, someone who did the quiet work in a cold shop and then went out and proved something that needed proving, put it in the comments below. I read every one of them, and I mean that, because those stories are the reason this channel exists. Every week here, we find another person who built something on purpose, who learned something deeply enough to trust it, who went out in the rain and let the distance markers do the talking. If that's the kind of story you come here for, subscribe, because there are more of them, and they deserve to be told. And if this one hit you the way it hit the people standing at that fence rail in the Harlan County, if you felt something go tight in your chest when that chain came taut and that old truck started to move, pass it on. Stories like this one don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. Lily's father's father wrote 40 pages in a notebook because he wanted the knowledge to outlast him. This is the same work. Pass it on.